and we have a lot more.
Oh.
But yeah, I think for now, we're gonna get started just for the sake of time. Inshallah, people will join as the meeting goes on.
No.
But I am going to start. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Jazakallah khairan for joining us today. My name is Hannah. I am one of the directors at the Eritrean Canadian Cultural Center, and we are really, really happy to be able to host this event that brings together the community for learning and also participating in a kind of give and take in terms of conversation that's natural, I think, to helping build our community, especially one where our aim is to continue to have a thriving community that builds on each other and grows day to day. Now, before we do get started, I'm going to just go through some of the housekeeping rules to make sure that we have an understanding how we want to run this conversation. I know that this is the third day of our lectures, so some of you may already be familiar with it, but each one is a little bit unique in and of its own, so I'm more than happy to reiterate some of them. So first and foremost, the conversation that we're going to have today are really intended to just be broad, general conversations that may or may not apply to your situation. And keep in mind that this isn't meant to replace any sort of medical advice or to provide any medical advice, but rather just give general educational information, and to always reach out to your healthcare professional for whatever the case may be if you're looking to make any changes in the future. Also, feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the chat. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, and I'll announce that, and we'll read some of those questions that are asked to our guests today at the very end. And lastly, we ask that everyone remains on mute, and for the sake of really making sure that we get the most out of this as possible, and to have fewer distractions, I'd say, that way. And that's it in terms of housekeeping rules. We are very happy to extend a warm welcome to our guest, Muna Ahmed, to culminate our lecture series with a conversation. She is a member of the Eritrean community. She's a registered social worker. She currently works as a psychotherapist. In terms of her background, I'm not going to give you too many sneak peeks or details. She'll be doing that for herself, just to make sure, it's worth the wait, I'd say. But we are going to get her to tell us about who she is, what she does, and why she does it, and then how we can use these pearls of knowledge that she has to then prepare for the month of Ramadan mentally as well. So without further ado, I'm going to do less talking, more listening, and let Muna take it away for us.
All right, thank you so much, Hannah. So assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. So yes, my name is Muna Ahmed. I am a registered social worker here in Ontario. And for the next hour, we will be discussing the topic of mental health, more specifically, how to take care of our mental health. So I'll just take a few minutes here to introduce myself properly and tell you about myself. So I moved to Canada, London, Ontario at the age of 10. I graduated from Western University with a Bachelor of Social Work. I graduated also from UFT with a Master's of Social Work, specializing in health and mental health in 2021. And like Hannah said, I am currently working as a psychotherapist remotely in a private practice. My passion has always been, as far as I can remember, working with people in a helping and healing capacity. I was attracted to the profession of social work among all the other helping professions because social work is broad, it really is. So I'm able to work in different settings, wear slightly different hats. And so the profession really spoke to different interests of mine. Sorry. Yes, as for our learning agenda for this evening, we'll be discussing the following. What is mental health? Why it's more than the mind, why it's crucial, how to maintain positive mental health, and when to seek professional help. Just a few friendly reminders. Feel free, like Hannah said, to type in your questions in the chat. There'll be a live Q&A at the end. And I also wanted to emphasize that some questions might need to be answered after the presentation in private or via email, just in the interest of time and potentially due to the complexity of the answer, maybe. So just keep that in mind. And so we'll start. What is mental health? Mental health is really a concept similar to physical health. It refers to a state of well-being. Mental health includes our emotions, our thoughts, feelings of connections to others, and just how to cope with life's highs and lows. Mental health and mental illness are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. So the presence or absence of a mental illness is not a predictor of mental health. So someone without a mental illness could have poor mental health, just as a person with a mental illness could have excellent mental health. For example, somebody with, schizophrenia as a diagnosis might have pretty decent mental health compared to somebody without a schizophrenia diagnosis who's really struggling with their mental health. Maybe they're, stressed out, anxious, or depressed, or not leaving the home, whatever it may be. So, having good mental health is more than just the absence of an illness. It really is a state of holistic well-being. And another thing I wanted to emphasize is that having issues with your mental health or your mental illness, it really is more common than we think. In any given year in Canada, 1 in 5 adults will experience a mental health concern. And just to emphasize this point a little bit further, I want to read you some statistics that I found on the website of Canadian Mental Health Association. So by age 40, about 50% of the population will have or have had a mental illness. Major depression affects approximately 5.4% of the Canadian population. Anxiety disorders affect 4.6% of the population. About 1% of Canadians will experience bipolar disorder. 1% will experience schizophrenia. Eating disorders, approximately 1 million Canadians, between 0.3 and 1% of the population. Substance use disorder affect approximately 6% of Canadians. So it's quite a lot of people, and unfortunately, so mental health, issues, it really can happen to anyone. It affects everyone, whether directly or indirectly, if you're supporting a loved one. And when it comes to the conversation of mental health, we cannot exclude suicide rate out of that conversation. Unfortunately, when mental illnesses or concerns go untreated for long, or it becomes a crisis of some sort, not always, but sometimes suicide is a risk factor. And so it's really important that we are reaching out and connecting with each other and making sure we're doing well. 4,012 Canadians died by suicide in 2019 alone. In Canada, suicide disproportionately impacts Indigenous peoples. The mortality rate due to suicide among men is 3 times the rate among women. But girls and young women are 3 times more likely than men to harm themselves and be hospitalized from self-harm. So just to distinguish, so self-harm, is different from suicide in the sense that self-harm, the intent is not to die. They're inflicting pain upon themselves, but without necessarily the intention to die. The psychology behind that really is that the emotional pain becomes so overwhelming that physical pain becomes some sort of release, and there is, biological changes that happens that reinforces that idea and that behavior, I mean. And so unfortunately you see that quite a lot, not a lot, but good amount, unfortunately, in young girls in high school, for example, or elementary. And then suicide is the second leading cause of death among youth and young adults between 15 and 34 years of age, I believe, after accidents. So it's also incredibly unfortunate on the impact of suicide on this particular age group. So the importance of mental health really lies in the fact that it causes an increase in our resilience to cope with the highs and lows of life. As Muslims, we know that Life is nothing but a test. And so being mentally healthy, we're equipped to persevere and continue on this life. And so it really is an important part of our overall well-being, because it underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. When we're mentally healthy, we cope better with stress, we're productive members of society, and we are more likely to reach our full potential. So it is incredibly essential. As for determinants of mental health goes, it really is multi-layered in the sense that, you'll find those determinants at the individual, at the social, at the structural, and they really combine to protect or undermine our mental health and shift, our position on that mental health continuum. As for psychological factors goes, we're talking about, our beliefs, our worldviews, our attitude, our motivation, our, emotional attachment and coping responses to life. So where we stand on those things really can either protect us or undermine our mental health. And a lot of the times they become goals of therapy, right? If they're not on the best place. As for biological factors, we're talking about, genetics, diet, sleep, age. When it comes to psychosis, for example, a lot of times you'll find people having their first episode, or they're more likely to be diagnosed in late teen, early adulthood, because the brain is still developing. But yeah, there is quite research to support that. As for as for exposure to unfavorable social, economic, geopolitical, and environmental circumstances, they also determine our mental health. It's not just factors that are within us that play a role here. The best example I could use right now, what's happening in Gaza, unfortunately, is devastating. It's been brutal couple months, and I think it's fair to say that we're all feeling, survival's guilt. We're all resisting feelings of hopelessness, but it's really impactful, right? And so that's probably one of the saddest examples to use, but to emphasize that point. As for early childhood experiences, when we're young, we're very impressionable and vulnerable. And if we're experiencing, negative or traumatic experiences when we're young, it really can shape our mental health in adulthood. And so, especially if we are not, if we have unprocessed trauma, for example, and we're carrying a lot of that trauma with us into adulthood, it could take a minute to correct that and address that in adulthood. As for protective factors go, we're talking about positive social interactions. That's hugely protective, quality education, decent work, just financial stability. When it comes to poverty, for example, it really does show that it is a major determinant of of mental and physical health. And then safe neighborhoods and community cohesion, and just, a sense of belongingness that's also hugely protective when it comes to our mental health. How do I maintain a positive mental health? So a balanced diet and plenty of water can improve our energy and focus throughout the day. So going back to that definition of mental health, that's seeing the mental health as a holistic aspect of our well-being. It really is connecting our mind and body. So when we're taking care of our body, we're indirectly taking care of our minds as well. And so it's really important that we are taking care of our body. Things like limiting caffeine, for example, especially if you have anxiety, because at the end of the day, it's a stimulant. It really does affect our mental health. And then sticking to a schedule and making sure you're sleeping, getting enough sleep, limiting the use of phone and other devices before bed, because it'll make it really hard for us to go to sleep. So really making sleep a priority. I cannot emphasize the impact of that when it comes to our mental health. Limiting the use of, scheduling regular times for a relaxing activity. I know we're all really busy, but developing, a consistent self-care routine, even in small ways throughout our day. Again, lots of research exists to support the positive impact of that on our mental health. And then identifying and challenging negative or unhelpful thoughts is also an important habit to start practicing as much as we can, because a lot of the times, when we're emotionally, charged, we're not always thinking rationally. We might be thinking, we might be consumed by the negative experience, and therefore our thoughts are not rational. I mean, a lot of the times we assume our thoughts equal facts, but that's not the truth, right? And sometimes we can experience cognitive distortions, and they could really make our mental health in a poor condition. So again, that skill could be learned or taught or further practiced through therapy. A lot of that is really the base of, like, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. But nonetheless, if you can just acknowledge your feelings and your thoughts, and bringing them into your, conscious awareness, maybe journaling about them, and see if you can develop, alternative way of thinking that's more helpful or realistic and rational, because it will, improve how you feel, and then most likely your behavior as well. And then reaching out to friends and family for emotional support. It's really important that we do not isolate ourselves. I know sometimes when we're feeling the greatest, our first, response might be to hibernate or avoid people. And, maybe it's okay if you want some space here and there, but if it continues to be a habit and you're noticing that your mental health is deteriorating, it's really important that you try your best to reach out to others, because it could honestly be life-saving sometimes as well. And then things like, practicing self-compassion. A lot of the times we're kinder to others than we are to ourselves. I'll have clients, for example, telling me about how they feel, their situations, and I will follow up with asking them, if your best friend thought the same way you're thinking, or felt the same way you're feeling, or is in your predicament, what would you say to her or to him? And usually they have all kinds of amazing, reasonable, lovely things to say. And if we could just say that to ourselves, it could, again, be very helpful. And then establishing a spiritual connection. I know in mainstream social work practices, that doesn't necessarily mean God. It just means, connecting to a higher being, or giving, your life purpose and meaningful, whatever that might be to you. It could be through nature or yoga or meditation. But I know, like, as Muslims, I can safely say that, establishing a connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is probably the best thing you could do for your mental health, in general terms, of course. Okay, and then another thing I want to emphasize is the impact of exercise on our mental health. So if you are not, in the habit of exercising and you want to improve your mental health, maybe consider exercise, because there's really good amount of research to suggest the, to suggest the positive impact of exercise on our mental health. I really do recommend it. And again, it doesn't mean that you have to go to the gym every day. It just means get your body moving, get sweaty, get your heart racing, whatever activity that may be. And I have clients who literally exercise not necessarily for the betterment of their bodies, but for their mental health. But obviously they're serving their bodies still indirectly. And so it is very effective. And then mindfulness is also, we're starting to see that concept in therapy more. There's more evidence to suggest that it could really improve your mental health. And I'll describe it as really a skill that's developed by deciding to slow down and taking the time to really pay attention and be curious about the things that we're experiencing and the things that we see around us. So each of us can be mindful, we just don't do it often. And most people who are new to mindfulness will start with three of its main parts, which is attention. So is number one, which is, bringing your focus and your attention right back to the present moment. You're not stuck in the past. You're not, preoccupied with the future. You're just bringing your focus and your attention to the present moment, to your body, to the sensations that you're experiencing. And then being curious about your thoughts and your feelings, not engaging with them in a judgmental way, but just observing what's going on in your mind and trying to be curious about where they come from, and practicing that, connection. And then acceptance is the third main part of this, which is really to accept your thoughts and your feelings, and where you at right now in this present moment. Especially a lot of the times pain comes when we're stuck in the past, for example, when we need to accept that we can't change the past, right? So accepting the present moment and what we've been through will it help us let go of some of that baggage that we carry. And then and this is not this passive existence, because yes, you accept that which is not in your control, but you're also working towards self-improvement by by focusing all of your energy on the things that you can control. And so, and when we're talking, from an Islamic perspective, I personally like to think mindfulness, the closest way we could do that is through prayer. I mean, when we're talking about khushu', for example, which is that sincere concentration and present prayer that we do in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, it's really hard to do because our mind is constantly racing. But for those times when we successfully do it, I think I'm not alone when I say it is incredible feeling. It is stabilizing. It is truly amazing for our mental health. So if you can get into the act of practicing that during prayer and outside of prayer, again, is a really effective strategy. And then when it comes to, treatment for mental health problems, they do vary. We have inpatient treatment, so that's, hospital, psychiatric ward. Alternative care is, things that not necessarily there isn't a lot of, evidence for, and they're not quite mainstream, but people still see benefit in, like hypnotherapy, yoga, meditation. And then prescription medication, we're talking about antipsychotics, antidepressants, those kinds of medications. And then counseling and therapy, and then support groups. So in terms of mental illness goes, research shows that the combination of prescription medication and counseling and therapy together is the most effective. So when do I seek professional help? So just a disclaimer, I am not a psychiatrist. I am a social worker. And so diagnoses are really out of scope of practice for me, ethically speaking. So this slide right here is really just to give you some very basic warning signs. It's not to say you have a mental illness. It's just these are some of the warning signs that you may want to consider talking to your GP or reaching out for therapy, especially if they've been going on for more than 2 weeks, let's say, and they're not improving. Like such as eating or sleeping too little or too much. So either way, having low energy, just feeling tired all the time for no reason, feeling unusually on edge, confused, scared, hearing voices or believing things that are not true, maybe a little bit of paranoia as well, or disorganized thinking, inability to perform daily tasks, and then loss of interest on the things that used to bring you joy. You just don't care for them anymore, and just the loss of functioning. And then lastly, I'll say, if you're starting to have thoughts of wanting to end your life or even harming others, that's a pretty major one that, should get you to definitely seek help almost immediately. Okay, so please do not hesitate to seek professional help. I know that sometimes because of mental health stigma, unfortunately, we're really hesitant to do that. But we should definitely care about our mental health the same way that we care about our physical health. It is equally as important. So that comes to the end of my presentation. I just wanted to thank you all for your undivided attention. I'm sorry if I was speaking really fast, but I hope you were able to catch what I was saying. And this is my email address. If anybody ever wants to connect or have any questions, it's on the slide. I'll just leave it for a minute extra, and then I will go ahead and stop sharing.
Jazakallah khairan, Muna. That was really great. I think it's, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing your contact information. I think even if we can probably keep that slide up throughout the entire conversation that we have about the questions and all of that, just in case someone wants to write it down really quickly.
I can put it on the chat actually
Yeah,
if you want.
actually, that's even better. Yeah, go for that. In the meantime, though, I really did find what you said about khushu' to be very, very interesting. I think you're right in that it is definitely an experience. It is something that we typically work towards having in every single salah that we pray. But I never thought to connect it to mindfulness. And you also mentioned about having, you know, an understanding of what we can and can't control and focusing on what we can control.
Right.
And I think that aspect, linking it to salah, just goes to show that, you know, everything is essential. I mean, everything is under the control of Allah, right? So what is truly in our hands is turning to Him, seeking guidance, asking for help, and so on and so forth. So really, it all goes hand in hand, right? So that's kind of the core, and that's why salah is such a big part of our day to day. Yeah, exactly that. Every day, every moment. So I thought that was quite interesting. I never thought to connect the dots in that way, but I appreciate that. I'm going to jump into the questions from our end first and foremost, and then I'll turn it over to the guests that are in attendance. If you do happen to have any questions for our guests, if you have any questions as we talk about it, or if you need clarification about a certain point, then definitely feel free to jump into the conversation. If you prefer to ask your question rather than typing it, we'll definitely have a moment for that as well, just to have you jump in, and we can ask those that are interested to unmute, and we could do it one by one. We'll play it by ear. We're pretty flexible. We do want to make sure that this conversation is engaging and everyone has the opportunity to communicate in the way that they best prefer. So for starters, especially with the month of Ramadan coming up, what are some ways in which you believe or from your professional opinion, think that is the best way to maintain the person's mental health while they're fasting, and if there are any differences that exist between fasting and non-fasting state, and maybe how that has an impact on our mental health and how we can manage all of that all together.
Right. Yeah, no, I would say there is a difference because at the end of the day, Ramadan is not meant to be easy. It's supposed to, you know, challenge our bodies and our minds and our spirits in that sense. So there is potential like risk factors like that disruption, you know, in our sleep routine and schedule changes, and so you'll find people getting kind of irritated because of those changes, even in our eating habits. Maybe a little bit of social anxiety because there's a lot of, you know, expectations and then just living in the West, there's a lack of, you know, religious accommodations when in the workplace especially. So yeah, so there is some challenges to our mental health when it comes to this holy month. And so if you have a history of mental health challenges, especially if you found Ramadan safe to be difficult for you in the past, I think it's important to recognize that and to identify what your triggers are. Like it's really important to know what your triggers are in terms of what I just mentioned as potential risk factors. Because when you know what your triggers are, you're able to work around them, maybe problem solve around them. So for example, I'm one of my biggest triggers is the lack of sleep. And so I'm able to again, only during the week, as much as I can. Maybe it's not everybody's preference, but that's what's been working for me, which is to skip Taraweeh and just head to bed right after Isha, wake up maybe an hour or two before Fajr, pray Tahajjud, pray Fajr, eat my suhoor, pray Fajr. That's been the schedule that I've been developed that works for me. And so, but it's kind of like that problem solving around my triggers. So, and then doing everything that you can do to maintain your mental health in the same way that when you are not fasting, right, as much as you can. That's, you know, doing the activities that mean a lot to you, for example, and taking care of your body as much as you can, and journaling, maybe, you know, talking to a friend, connecting, right? So yeah, that's what I'd say, really. about this question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's really important for us to sit down and reflect on what those triggers are, right? Because for every person, it's going to be a little different.
Right.
It just be
Exactly.
adjusting your schedule. Okay,
Exactly.
that's
Exactly.
fair. Now, in terms of when we say, for the month of Ramadan, I think for some, even the concept of reflecting is, I mean, it's not an easy task, right? It's one word, but really it takes a lot to do. But Ramadan does come with it sort of like a to-do list, right? Sometimes everyone's kind of like, I need to do this before Ramadan, or I need to do this for Ramadan. So it kind of adds on to our typical day-to-day, which alhamdulillah is a good problem to have in the grand scheme of things. But for others, it can feel like a bit of a burden, right? It can feel like a load that's being put on top of the things that may already exist, especially with the number of tasks, as I said, that we typically put on ourselves to maximize the holy month of Ramadan. Now, what would you say to someone who wants to make the most out of the month of Ramadan without reaching anything close to burnout? So maximizing as much as possible without feeling like they are running out of fuel.
Right. Yeah. So I don't say this lightly, and maybe I shouldn't even start with it, but it's just something that I think is important to be said, which is that you may be exempted from fasting. A lot of the times we don't think about it, or we don't see it as that, but mental health challenges are a valid reason for not fasting. For example, people with eating disorders, fasting will just sometimes will worsen their symptoms or the recovery. And so just as a mental note, depending on what's going on with you, you might be excused from fasting, and it really doesn't has nothing to do with the strength of your faith, and it's Allah's mercy. So I'll just say that. And then if you are taking mental health medications, just make sure you're reaching out to your psychiatrist, for example. See if you can, if you're taking them during the day, if you can take them, let's say, in the evening or whatever, but do not make changes without consulting your psychiatrist, just because of the level of side effects that exist with those medications. And then I'll say consider attending therapy. I mean, this month is about self-improvement, right? It's about reaching that level of taqwa. And again, when we're connecting our mind and our body and our spirit, our mind is part of that, right? If you really want to reach excellence, you really got to be in good shape mentally. And so if therapy, and you have the luxury and privilege to do therapy, and you have the time, I would say definitely consider therapy. And then lastly, just in terms of when it comes to those to-do lists, I've noticed in my life or people around me, a lot of those to-do lists that we put upon ourselves in this holy month, they're not really religiously based. You know what I mean? Like, we can live without them. If you can remove some of those to-do lists, or delegate some things, just consider doing that. Because yeah, it might not have, it might come at the expense of you enjoying this month, right? And if you can, it's just a last minute thought really that I have to that question.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So I think we do. There's definitely a pressure where we feel like, what, this is the month where we're just going to turn over a completely new leaf, for whatever reason, and staggering it throughout the year as opposed to maybe throughout the month might be a great way to tackle that. You did mention something about seeking out professional help and using, I mean, that the Ramadan is really not a month where that's exempt, right? But where is it that the stigma regarding mental health and seeking out that professional help stem from it in not just our community, but other communities as well, as a
Yes.
general idea? And what would you say to someone that's having trouble tackling that stigma that exists?
Yeah. No, yeah. So I appreciate you asking that question and then following up with saying that it's not just in our community. It really is a global issue, unfortunately. And when we're talking about stigma, we're talking about lack of acceptance, the prejudice, the discrimination that happens to those who are suffering from a mental health. And I think one factor that contributes to this stigma is definitely the concealability, right, element of the disorder. It's not something we can see, and so a lot of the times it's easier to either blame the individual or dismiss it. And so you'll see sometimes, families I mean, this actually happens, where, they'll hide their child who is suffering from psychosis, for example, because they just don't understand what's going on, and they can't see it, right? They don't understand what's happening. And so that is a major, I think, contributor probably to this level of stigma. And then another thing is that some Muslims, I think they believe, it's their doctrine, that a mental illness is a punishment from God, right? Which causes, enormous guilt and shame again in those suffering, especially when fasting, reading Quran, asking for forgiveness, prayer 24/7. None of this is working, right? And so that makes seeking treatment really, really difficult and challenging for those who are suffering. And then another thing that you see is, because physical illness is less stigmatized, you'll find a lot of people in our community experiencing and expressing mental health symptoms as physical symptoms. So like feelings like, worthlessness, hopelessness, anxiety, they're not acknowledged. And so you'll see sometimes when especially women who, when they first present with when they're eventually, are diagnosed with depression, they first actually present with, conversion disorders, which really is a condition that interrupts and disrupts your brain work, how your brain works. The emotional aspect of what you're going through actually disrupts how your brain works, right? And so this causes physical symptoms like that person cannot control, like seizures, weakness or paralysis, reduced input like from senses like sight, sound. And so this condition is often treatable through therapy. But yeah, so this starts presenting itself when you're suppressing a lot of that emotional pain, right? And mental health symptoms. And then lastly, I'll say is that another factor that I've noticed plays a huge role, again, is the, in Islam, we believe in the existence of jinn. It's verified in the Quran. And so it's very common that you'll see Muslims confuse psychiatric symptoms, such as psychosis, when, they're losing that connection to reality, with jinn possession. And so that may prevent patients and families members to seek medical and psychiatric services. Instead, they're at the imam's door, the imam's door instead of, a hospital, for example. And then when it comes to gender differences, the stigma really does affect women in the sense that they fear seeking psychiatric care due to never getting married. That's a huge fear, right? And being disregarded as unsuitable candidate for marriage simply because of your mental illness diagnoses. So again, you see that all the time. And then I think as for what to do, I think reading, learning as much as you can, educating yourself on mental health, because nowadays there's a lot of resources out there to educate you. So many Muslim therapists and organizations are out there actually trying to fight this stigma. So seek those resources and support. A lot of the times my role as a Muslim therapist is to validate clients' struggle, because it's one thing to be struggling mentally and then to be told that you're struggling because you're not close to God, for example, because it really signals a sense of, failure as a Muslim. Again, it's no doubt that establishing, that close connection to Allah is going to help you in the long run. But it doesn't mean it's like this bulletproof vest against having mental health problems. I always like to use the example of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who, there was a whole Am al-Huzn, the year of sadness and grief that he went through and experienced as a result of the death of his wife, I believe, and his uncle as well. So yeah, so again, I really focus as a Muslim client, as a Muslim therapist, to validate the experiences of Muslim clients. I have clients, I'm sorry, but the last thing I'll say is I have clients who really hide the fact that they're seeking therapy from their own family members, or start taking mental health medications and then stop because they cannot tolerate the anxiety of their family coming in and finding that medication in the room or whatever. So they'd rather stop when the treatment was actually working. And so things like that, it really is unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. I think those are some valuable ways to address them, and I think it's even more interesting to hear about the ways that it can exist, right? So even just someone just someone, I guess, experiencing maybe a worsening of their symptoms or condition simply from the fear of, actually not simply, but from the fear that stems from being found out about that particular condition, right? So it feels like a never-ending cycle that affects the individual. Now, the stigma exists because, for multiple reasons, and you covered many of the reasons that can contribute to it. Now, and we acknowledge that this can exist. It is a global issue. It can exist in multiple communities, or it does exist in many, many communities. Now, when it comes to the conversation regarding mental health and well-being, how do we, as a community, encourage those conversations to take place? And what I mean by that, just to be clear, is really what are some tangible things that we can do? Because yes, we can have conversations, right? We can have a one-on-one, we can have a group session, but what can we do to make it so that it's really ingrained in the community? Conversation is no longer, spotlights are great. It's good to have these conversations where we just focus on this in particular, but eventually I think we want to get to a place where the community is having these conversations and creating an environment where it's safe to talk on it regularly, right? We won't necessarily need a single space for it to exist, right? We don't need maybe just one room or one day in a month or whatever the case may be. We just want it to be all around. It's always a safe conversation in any space whatsoever. So how do we do that, right? How do we break down that barrier? How do we break down that stigma? Slowly. I mean, it's not gonna happen overnight. I know.
That's literally what I was gonna say. I'm like, it's gonna take a minute. It's
Yeah,
gonna take a minute.
yeah.
As for tangible solutions goes, I'm thinking about the Muslim community right away. I mean, I think your question is outside maybe or just in general, or but regardless, if we're focusing on the Muslim community, I think if possible, involving our religious leaders. I mean, they have to endorse some of those mental health campaigns. They have to speak about it in their khutbah. They have to normalize that because we really do look up to them, we do. And so especially when there's that connection of, or that guilt where it's like, oh, if we're mentally ill, we are not good Muslims, right? That messaging, I think, can only be dismantled for the most part from some of those major, voices in our religious community. And then I think one of the biggest thing I think is helpful personally is when it comes to this conversation, which is what I was trying to do in this presentation, is looking at it as a holistic thing. Instead of focusing on mental illnesses, we're focusing also on mental wellness, right? Okay, we're not suffering with mental illness. Nobody's saying that. But how can we still enhance our mental well-being, Because we all have moments and phases. So, just prioritizing that the way that we prioritize our physical health, I think, is really important. And yeah, no, that's a tough one, but those are some of like my, my thoughts on it. And then I would like to have, mental health professionals, especially Muslims, be, a normal part of our community. If we're talking about schools or even at the mosques, a lot of the times when it comes to counseling, which obviously, is important, we do reach out to our imams, but perhaps we can have mental health professionals as well, right? So yeah, so those are some of my thoughts on that question.
That's so true. Yeah, no, I never thought about that, to have them be a staple part of the actual conversation or part of the team, right? As essential as the other leaders that exist within the team of the masjid itself. Yeah, no, I can imagine it's definitely not something that can be done overnight, but it's sky's the limit, right? So why not reach for it? And if we aim to get there, then we can take the small steps. And,
Right.
Honestly, it might just mean, you mentioned great ideas. It might also mean just having these conversations until it,
Right. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
bit by bit, creating a spotlight and then moving forward from there. Inshallah, we're able to create an environment that, like you said, nurtures mental well-being, right? And that's more of a day-to-day.
Mm.
Now, I have I mean, everyone feel free to ask your questions. I do have a question from one individual that's part of this conversation right now, who's asking, what are the main symptoms of mental illness so that a person can treat them before they become severe?
Yeah.
What are some, I guess, warning signs that maybe you can highlight?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this person was in the conversation when I said that. I don't typically talk too much about that part of diagnoses or whatever, because people tend to take that a bit seriously and run with it when you really need to talk to your healthcare provider if you're concerned. But in general, just some warning signs, like I mentioned earlier, is eating too much, eating too little, lack of sleep, just feeling anxious and stressed out all the time, maybe tired when you have no idea why. Maybe having suicidal ideation is also a major concern. You should seek professional help right away. When it comes to depression specifically, one of the major one is loss of interest in activity. And just consumed with feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. Yeah, so I would say those are some of the main symptoms of mental illness.
Okay.
Because yeah, I do enjoy the fact that there's a question there where when they can become severe. Because yeah, if they're left untreated for so long, things like, for example, depression, it can turn into having a psychotic episode, for example, right? Things like that. So early intervention and having that understanding and connection to your mental health so that you can catch some of those warning signs, I think will help in your treatment.
Yep. And in terms of, I think we're going to switch gears a little bit, or maybe, I mean, we're a little bit, but what would you say are the effects that social media has on an individual's mental health? What have we seen, and what are we seeing?
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually a documentary, I think, on Netflix. It's called The Social Dilemma. If you guys have not seen it, I do recommend it. It really does talk about some of those difficulties. Maybe not so much in mental health, but just like talks about the darker side of social media. But in general, you can't say that social media is entirely positive or entirely negative, right? It really is both at the same time. Some of the positive impact we already seen just this last year, and we're still seeing what's happening in Gaza without social media. I don't think we would have received that much honest journalism about it. Social media has really changed a lot of minds and hearts when it comes to this topic, and it's being used as a tool to fight colonization and Islamophobia. And then obviously social media is a platform where you can connect, right? That's the intention really behind it, is that we can connect as a world, especially if we're feeling socially isolated. And then we're seeking a lot of information and resources through social media that maybe wouldn't have been accessible. So those are the benefits that I do want to highlight. As for its impact on our mental health goes, it's starting out to come now that there is research starting to link excessive social media use to mental health issues. So there, especially in young adults, mainly because of the social comparison element to it, right? And confusing views with likes, views and likes with our value, like as a human. I know when Facebook first came, I remember feeling as a teenager myself, like, oh my gosh, how many likes am I, being obsessive about how many likes, you're getting, how many comments, and if you're not getting enough, you worry that you're being categorized in the loser department or something, right? And so it really does affect us. And it's really important that we use it with caution. And then yeah, I mean, it's used. I think social media is used to make us addicted because it uses our psychology against us. And I think when I use social media, at least I'm really mentally, sometimes I have to remind myself that people are not posting their struggles. So sometimes when you're on social media, you might think you're the only one struggling, but everybody's going to filter out a lot of that, right? Especially those influencers. I mean, there's financial compensation and to glorifying their lives, right? And so So just be aware, because I do think a lot of us get in the habit of just mindlessly scrolling before bed, for example, and before we know it, it's past midnight. And we do use it as a coping mechanism a lot of the times from our own, distressful anxiety or thoughts that is going on. So just be cautious, be mindful, because there's research to suggest that it is not that very good for our mental health.
Yeah, no, that's good to know, and I'll definitely be sure to check out that the show, the Netflix special, I think, or the Netflix show that you said,
Social dilemma.
The Social
Social
Dilemma. Okay, so I'll be sure to check that out and see what that's
Yeah,
like.
it's really well done.
We do have another question, and then I'll pass it to, I guess, the floor, open it up a little bit. If there is anyone that wants to ask a question, then feel free to jump in after this one. Once we finish answering it, you can unmute yourself and ask away, and then we'll see how that goes from there. So the question is, do people suffer from mental illnesses since childhood, and the illness then appears in old age? Is that possible?
Is that what the question is asking, or is it asking in general, do people suffer from mental illnesses since childhood and then the illness appears in old age?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if we don't, if we're misunderstanding it, then feel free to, for the individual
No,
that,
no.
feel
I mean,
free to.
I will say that in general,
Yeah, I mean to say sorry for that.
no, it's
The
okay.
illness has been hiding since childhood, and when he grows up, then it appears the illness.
Yeah, okay, I see your point. Well, from what I have been, taught and reading, when it comes to let's say two people are going through the exact same experience in life, or the traumatic experience, and let's say they have one person doesn't activate their mental illness, and one person is mentally ill. What usually happens is that we actually have a predisposition, in terms of genetically speaking, right? And so whatever traumatic incident that we experience in old age gets activated. So just to answer the nature versus nurture question, because I thought maybe that's what it was referring to. But I do think it is possible that sometimes our, whatever we experience since childhood can come crashing down in adulthood. How does that happen? The science behind that, I could really talk about it too much. But yeah, in general, I could safely say that yes, it is possible that would happen.
Okay, so I guess one of the ways is that there's multiple factors that contribute to how it exists later on in life, and genetics plays a role in it. So
Exactly.
two people can have the same sort of condition or experience as a younger age, or at a younger age, but later on in life, one of the factors that determines how it exists is genetics, right?
Yes.
As they grow older. Okay.
Yes.
That's great. That's good to know. We are coming closer to the end of the session. But I just want to make sure that we have allowed for those that would prefer to speak, to ask their questions, to do that. So if you would like to unmute and ask your question, go for it. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll round, I mean, if you, for instance, or an individual has not had the chance to ask their question, she did put her email in the chat, and we can send that out again, actually. If so, you can reach out to her at any point in time and ask your questions, and anything you really want clarification on, maybe about something that we talked about in this particular session. And yeah, we'll take like 10 seconds and see if anyone feels like they want to ask. Okay. In the meantime, then, what we'll do is we are going to come to an end, really. First and foremost, on behalf of ECCC, I would like to thank our speaker, Muna Ahmed, for taking the time out of her day and speaking to the community. I know that this was definitely a valuable conversation and a valuable time spent learning about our mental health and what it is we can do and what we want to, focus on when we're essentially managing our mental health during the upcoming month of Ramadan, and also, you know, carrying that forward into the rest of our days as well, inshallah. I think it's good to use Ramadan as an opportunity to tackle a lot of the things that maybe we might have been putting off. But really and truly, these are just skills and things that we're learning to apply throughout the year, right? It's not just a one-time thing. I would also really like to thank our attendees for participating and for your continued engagement in our endeavors as we, you know, try to essentially really contribute to the community, to the Eritrean community, and to make sure that we are providing access to education in a way, and we're allowing for more of a inclusive conversational space to learn from the individuals that are professionals in their field, and to really learn from one another. I think that's the biggest thing that ECCC is learning or wants to promote. It's education, whether that's educating the youth or educating each other, right? We have so much to learn about from each individual. We all specialize in our different fields. But that is a little long-winded, I know. But like I said earlier, jazakallah khairan everyone for attending, and jazakallah khairan Muna as well for taking the time out. Did you have any last words, last messages, anything you want to leave us off with before we end this conversation?
No, I just want to thank you for inviting me and for, you know, taking the time. And I really appreciate everybody who attended. And thank you. So
All right, perfect. All right, then I think alhamdulillah, this culminates our series for those attending, and we will inshallah have a lovely Ramadan, inshallah. And we will see everyone really at our future talks. And then as for the pre-Ramadan lectures, we will see everyone next year, inshallah. So yeah, assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Assalamu alaikum.